welcome to our gathering, our panel of all the authors of Thinly Veiled, which is the 5th edition of the Castle of Horror Anthology. I have with me basically almost every author in the book, save a couple that are literally on the other side of the earth, although that's true for at least one person who is in here at the moment. So what is Thinly Veiled? For those of you watching, this is actually a picture of it. Churl Yo, who is next to me on my screen, is the one who designed the cover. We've been doing the Castle of Horror Anthology for a couple of years, and always we have a different theme. And this time around, the theme was take a popular 1970s property and do something creative with it, where you make something original and veil the property so that we don't get sued. And so that for instance, Henry Hertz's story about the Partridge Family became something with a different name. And a lot of people immediately got into that. So what I'm going to do is go through and introduce each of our authors and have them describe what their story is about and what inspired them, and then we'll open it up to questions. And I know that one question that people often have is, what is, how do you put together the order of these things? Because when we've got a bunch of stories, how do I decide it? And I have a few tips and tricks for how to put together the stories. So let's kick it off. I will start with Churl Yo. You had the first story, which is called Eastbound and Down. And also, I should mention that you are a co-publisher at Castlebridge Media. You founded the company with me. I recently put up a photograph of us in the 80s.
Yeah, thanks.
And I met everybody. I met Churl. I literally met Churl in the 5th grade. I think it was 1984, I think, and we made a short film together. So anyway, Churl is the guy who creates all of our covers and does the layouts, and he's also written a couple of books. So Churl, talk about whatever you want to talk about. I'd love for you to talk about what went into the cover, but I also want you to talk about your stories. You can take those in any order that you want.
Okay. Well, when you first suggested Thinly Veiled as a theme for Volume 5, I mean, as soon as you said it, I was immediately hooked, right? I'm a child of the 70s, which might be sharing a little too much information, but I remember, watching MASH, Sanford and Son, The Odd Couple when I was a kid. So, immediately I thought, man, this is going to be fun to take these nostalgic properties and just riff off of them, right? Yeah. So, just reading all of these stories that you guys have written, it's clear that, everyone had a great time writing them, and I enjoyed reading them. So, as Jason hints in the introduction in the book, I think we really hit on something here, right? If the response is as positive as I think it will be, and Jason just mentioned this a little bit ago before we started, like a Thinly Veiled 80s or a Thinly Veiled 90s, could definitely be coming soon. I think it's just the natural thing to do. The cover came about because we wanted to get some sort of iconography of like something from the 70s. So, they had those groovy television sets, and, we were riffing off of TV properties and movies and things of that nature. So I found like this perfect orange television on a kitchen counter with like these orange and green ceramic coffee mugs that are straight out of the 70s. And I thought, well, this is a great image we can use. And we found this really creepy looking photo of a family in the 1970s that
I don't know who those poor people are, but yes, right.
Yeah, we don't know who they are. But I thought, why don't we superimpose that image on the TV screen and people can just, figure out whatever, think about whatever it is they want to think about it. But it is kind of a creepy image. It's a little hard to see because we kind of, I put it inside the screen, which has to do with layers in Photoshop. But if you see the actual original image, it is a little creepy. But for my story, which is called East, Down, and Bound, it's a take on Smokey and the Bandit. which I just loved seeing as a kid. But I didn't see it in a theater. I saw it on HBO back when you needed a special cable box to watch HBO, and you'd get those little tiny catalogs in the mail every month when they told you what was coming. And if you missed seeing Smokey and the Bandit when it premiered on a Friday, they show it again on Saturday, and then they show it again on Sunday. And after a while, because I don't think they had a very deep catalog of movies or shows that they could show, you could see it like 2 or 3 times a day. I mean, that might be an exaggeration, but I remember I must have seen Smokey and the Bandit a dozen times, right? And I wanted to be driving that Trans Am, and I wanted, those car chases were so cool, right? So, and this was all pre Dukes of Hazzard. I think Dukes of Hazzard came about as a result of Smokey and the Bandit, but it established that formula of like a happy-go-lucky anti-hero going up against a bumbling sheriff. And I thought, why not take that idea and kind of flip it from something really light and airy into something kind of dark. And as an added layer, I wanted to bring my own kind of Asian American experience growing up in the South. So now, for my story, you not only have to deal with having this bet of driving across the country in 28 hours to pick up 400 cases of illegal Coors beer, you also have to contend with being a minority, because my main character is Korean, traveling across kind of this historically intolerant region of the United States, while being stalked by this kind of larger-than-life homicidal lawman. So that was kind of the premise of the story, and I had a really great time writing it. It just kind of wrote itself, honestly. But that's what my story's about.
Thank you very much. That was a really great example of how to place your story in the world. And also, I really want to figure out if I could go to eBay and order a bunch of old HBO guides, because I think that would be so cool just to get a bunch of those. Well, cool. Madeline, if you're on, your title is almost longer than my story, actually, but it's you and I talked about this story before it was done.
Yes.
And it's called "You Are Cordially Invited to an Evening of Horror at the Secret Hills Golf and Country Club." Can you talk about that?
Yeah, thanks. So You're Cordially Invited began a few years ago, actually. I had this idea probably during my nth time watching Halloween, the 1978 Halloween. And I started to wonder where all the parents in Haddonfield were. But not just in Haddonfield, in that genre of film generally. Where are the parents during Scream? Where are the parents during, any other during Friday the 13th? Where are the parents? And so I landed on the idea that they were all together. That all the parents, while their children are being murdered, are together somewhere. Yeah. And that they are all at the same Halloween party or Christmas party or whatever, but they're all at the same party. And at the end of the night, there's a raffle and everybody's a winner. And I really wanted to sort of ask where these folks were and what they could possibly be doing. Mm-hmm. And if they knew, if they had noticed any kind of pattern over the years. And that was sort of the impetus for the story. And you and I talked a lot about, how much, the classic, what for me, I think is the classic 70s question of what did they know and when did they know it?
Yeah.
And that becomes the sort of fulcrum of the story. And that's I think once we landed on that, it was much easier to land the plane at that point.
That was a lot of fun, seeing that process of a story that didn't have an ending, and then seeing you bring an ending together. And to me, what I loved is how reminiscent of the lottery this was. I don't know if that was your intent or not, but just this sort of the matter-of-factness of the way everybody was talking about this insane thing that their community does.
Yeah, well, I wanted it to be kind of you know, a bit like the lottery, like this is what we do to preserve our community.
Yeah.
But also sort of a bit, you know, a bit folk horror-y, horror-ish, folk horrific. And a bit and a bit like a bit paranoid, appropriately 70s paranoia.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted there to be that Wickermanish kind of feeling of, or Harvest, or we talked a lot about Harvest Home, Thomas Tryon novel and the TV special. And we talked actually a lot about sort of 70s TV horror movies of the week, the ABC movie of the week, and like things like, you know, Satan's School for Girls and
it's no
Double
secret,
Double.
I'll literally
like,
talk about those for no reason whatsoever, actually.
Yeah, like, well, we were sort of talking, like, I think you're actually one of the, it was really great because when we were talking about this, you said, well, what are your influences here? And I said, well, one, I'm married to a horror writer by the name of David Nichol. So we just we watch a lot of horror all the time. I'm normally known as a science fiction writer, but I actually watch a lot. I consume way more horror content than I do SF content.
That's awesome.
Mostly because like after a while you can kind of start to see the seams. It's like being a filmmaker and watching a lot of films. And so it's one of the things I consume a great deal more of, and one of the things that we talk about at home more frequently. So this idea just sort of bit in, and like it was like a tick, like it wouldn't let go, and so I had to sort of get it out.
That's fantastic. I thank you very much, and hopefully we'll get to come around again and talk some more. Jeremiah, totally different kind of story, and yet also obsessed with 70s. In this case, kind of the satanic panic and the whole obsession with whether or not Kiss was satanic. Talk to us about the Blood Inked comic book.
So my story came out of some reflection on the 1970s horror comics and music.
And let me interrupt. Jeremiah Dillon, I should say your whole name, Jeremiah Dillon Cook. If I don't say your whole name, please remind me to, because I owe you that much. So, all right, go ahead. Yes.
I have a million pseudonyms. A lot of people call me JD Cook. My family calls me Dylan. Jeremiah was a bullfrog, you know, all that stuff. So any name is fine with me. My story came out of a lot of thinking about 1970s horror culture and comics and music. So Satan was a huge draw at the box office with films such as The Exorcist and The Omen. They were doing big business at this time. And then in comics, a revision of the Comics Code in 1971 allowed Marvel to start introducing darker characters. So we had Ghost Rider and Hellstrom were two characters that were created in the 70s. And they were both created by Roy Thomas. And then, of course, in music, Hell was selling with many rock bands, but Kiss was explicitly stating it with Gene Simmons calling himself the Demon. I was more of a Rush fan growing up, but I was always fascinated with Kiss's famous team up with Marvel, where they put their blood into the ink of a comic book issue. I've always also been fascinated with the idea of books that drive their readers crazy, like the Necronomicon and the play The King in Yellow. And a quick side note, I have to get this out here, I guess. So Marvel actually has its own thinly veiled version of the Necronomicon called the Darkhold, which actually just showed up in WandaVision. And that was actually introduced in the 70s as well. And then also, speaking of Marvel, I was able to draw on my experience interviewing for an internship with Marvel in college to kind of flesh out my story, to put details on what the HQ looks like for the main setting in my story, which is a thinly veiled version of Marvel. So anyway, I put all this stuff together in my head, stirred it all together, and then I got the Blood Ink comic book. And then, in essence, I took all the satanic panic fears about what the 70s horror comics and music was doing to children, and I made a story where those fears were literal. So, by using the thinly veiled version of Marvel and Roy Thomas and Kiss. And just in case anyone wants to do a scavenger hunt with the story, There are 23 total thinly veiled references to find. Most are for Marvel, but there are some for other pop culture stuff. Like, well, I won't say because I want people to take a look for it and try to figure it out themselves. But that's all I got.
That's wonderful, and I because I was so familiar with the subject matter, I really enjoyed reading this. I mean, and because I'm old, so I was aware of all of that, at the time. I remember it very well. Henry Herz, you did a similar thing, and you actually, Dylan, did you consider? But before I let you go, did you consider, like, Henry put together, for what it's worth, an actual reader's guide briefly of his story where he referenced like what he was referencing in the story. And I'm just curious if you have that laying around anywhere.
I do. I have it. Actually, I have it on my desktop. So just in case, I was like, I reread through it pretty recently, and I was like, let me make sure I remember what everything is, just so I have it. So yep,
Great.
So I know what everything is. I know what the unveiled version of every thinly veiled reference is.
I love it. That's really cool. Thank you very, very much. Henry, so yours is just so densely packed with references that it's almost impossible to unthread. But it's the Crow family, and why don't you tell? I mean, rather than me saying it, why don't you tell us what is a parody of? And boy, it goes deep.
So this is a horror anthology, and my thought was, let me try and go in the opposite direction, find something as pure as the driven snow, something innocent, and like, so you got this. And what hit me was the Partridge Family from 70s TV, this, white bread family. They play really soft pop rock. So I started flipping things. I'm like, well, instead of just humans, how about if these are just a bunch of shape-shifting monsters that mimic a human family, but they're not related. They're just allies. And the leader of the group, the mastermind, is the Danny Bonaducci, the 10-year-old kid in the Partridge Family. 10-year-old bass player is in fact an 800-year-old Norse vampire. And the other characters are other types of monsters that can shapeshift. And then I was like, okay, well, let's also flip the music. So what's the opposite end of the musical spectrum from soft pop rock? Death metal. Okay, so they in the story, they've invented death metal. And of course, I couldn't use the name Partridge Family. So I thought, well, what's another avian name? And I came up with A Murder of Crows. That's the name of their band. Has the word murder in it, which is appropriate. And
perfect.
And then I started researching the Partridge Family with an eye toward what things could I take and flip or leverage. And unless you're a Partridge Family geek, which there are probably not very many, I certainly didn't know all this stuff. I kind of like having a little author's note at the end, just to kind of let people know, clue them in on the, I'm winking at the audience and at the Partridge Family, but if you're not a geek on that stuff, you wouldn't know it. So it's kind of like, might as well tell people about it if they care, if they don't spot it already. Like the group has several songs that I mentioned by name, which are tweaked versions of actual Partridge Family songs and things like that.
Wow. I mean, that's really lovely. I just want to ask you, like, so if you weren't all that familiar with the Partridge Family, although, obviously you dove in so that you could be, but were you that familiar with death metal? I mean, in other words, there's this thing where, verisimilitude, all you have to do, all you as the creator have to do is be just like 3 steps ahead of me, the reader, so that I believe whatever the hell you're saying. And I believed, that you knew something about death metal here. I don't know. I'm more likely to listen to the Partridge Family, frankly. So
what separates you and I is I looked in Wikipedia about death metal. So that's the degree of my expertise with death metal. It was just enough so I could use some adjectives and, again, as you say, just stay one step ahead of the typical reader.
Yeah.
Get the names of some classic death metal groups, and that was enough.
That's fantastic. So, all right, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Dennis, your story, Dennis Crosby, your story, The Boneyard, I thought was very touching, and tell me about it.
When I got this, I Henry sent me the link for that you were looking for stories, and I'm like, what could really be fun from the 70s that I could, tackle and make into a horror story. And I was actually right in the middle of working on my next novel, so I was already kind of in that supernatural urban fantasy mindset. And as I thought about this story more, I'm like, it would be great to have something that involves, kind of that demon feel and that otherworldly sense of ethereal things happening. But I wanted to have a little bit of humor to it and something that people could, kind of connect with and remember fondly. And I just literally had a conversation a few weeks before that about Sanford and Son and how iconic that show was, and more importantly, how the humor still holds up. Like, you can watch an episode now, and it's still just as funny as it was when it first came out. So a lot of dynamics in that story or in that show, I think, that people overlook because of the comedy. There's this kind of tension between the father and the son. Lamont very much wants to get out. He does not want to be at that junkyard. That's not how he wants to define his life. He's always looking for this get rich quick scheme so he can just get out of Dodge. And Fred's always looking to hold him back. So I'm like, well, there's got to be a reason for that. Maybe we can find a really fun reason for that. And so what's more fun than having the junkyard that they run being this sort of hellmouth?
Yeah.
And, Fred is there because he's got to keep guard. And he's keeping Lamont there because Lamont has to take his place once he dies. So getting a chance to really kind of explore that and give a different explanation as to why they had the dynamic that they did was really fun to just kind of write and explore. And then adding those humor pieces to it too, Fred hating Aunt Edna and why, because she's a demon. That's why. Yeah. Having those little jabs back and forth between the two of them. What I always loved about Sanford and Son was that secret drawer that he had where he would keep, his valuables, and he had like this secret code to slam a bottle down and tap the top of the desk, and then the drawer would automatically open. So I wanted to make sure I added that piece. The other funny piece was him having this drawer full of glasses. I always had these eyeglasses, and he's always going through them because he doesn't know which prescription is going to work at the time. So it was important to add that element into, again, a throwback to the show so that people can get into the feel of it, but giving that supernatural explanation as to why they're there and why they have this sense of friction between the two of them.
I only tangential. I remember we used to watch some Sanford and Son, and I have no sense of the continuity of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of those things where I've heard that actually the early episodes are actually strangely much more serious than the later episodes.
In some ways, yeah. I think they touch a little bit more on the dynamic between Fred and Lamont in the earlier episodes. So where like Fred is desperate to get out. They argue, they just battle back and forth. And I think once they saw that it was really going to be a hit show, they started to ease up on that and focus a little bit more on the comedy. There's still kind of that dynamic, but they eased up on that a bit, started adding more characters in it to give it more that feel, that neighborhood feel. So yeah, it's definitely a little bit more serious in the beginning, the earlier episodes.
That's true of a lot of sitcoms, and I'm so fascinated by sitcoms, right? So one of the things that strikes me is us doing this project to try to do stories based on famous sitcoms. You can kind of drill into what the kernel is that really intrigued you. Like what you're keying in on is, look, if you take away all the gags and everything, really what this is about is father and son.
Yeah.
Who so much need one another and are also so much repelling one another.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's really good. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Very wee early in the morning, Rob.
It is.
Yes. Okay. Yours is bonkers. This is a truly strange story. So if you could tell us about those meddling kids, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, here's the book. It is available in England, so I've got a copy. Yes. I'm not very good at watching television, I'm afraid. So there's a lot of television and films that I've heard of, but I don't know enough about them to write a story. But it was such a good idea. I wanted to write for this, and I researched television programs, and there's a few that I do remember. Obviously the Partridge Family, Charlie's Angels, things like that, which were available over here.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid much of it will be lost on me. But one thing that I did remember fondly was the Scooby-Doo cartoons. And so that's what I plumped for. And the main problem I had with writing the story was, how do I include a talking dog? Because that doesn't happen. So eventually I decided that to have a talking dog in the story, I had to set it in the world of animation. So that sort of prompted the setting of the story. I had the two rival cartoon companies. And then, having decided to set it within the animated world, I realized now I can do anything. Anything could happen now. And so obviously I had to keep to the essence of a Scooby-Doo tale. So there had to be a fake haunting. There had to be Scooby snacks. They had to split up to explore and investigate. But essentially you wanted a horror story. So I had to adapt it, and to have a horror in a cartoon world, I realized that's where I could do anything. I could kill off these characters in horrific cartoon ways. So I did. And that's sort of where it came from.
One of my favorite things about this story is there's a moment where it literally like loops itself, where I'm trying to remember exactly how it goes, but where just like the background in a Scooby-Doo cartoon, the story starts to repeat in a sense. I sort of interrupted the story a couple of times to put in commercial breaks. Yes.
So that's where there had to be a reprise after the break to retell the story. So it did loop back a few times.
So you had, did you actually, forgive me for not understanding, did you not watch Scooby-Doo when you?
Oh, no, I did. Okay. But these days I watch so little. I'd have trouble doing one set now. But in the 70s, I do remember them. I'm that old. I was a teenager at the time.
Sure.
But I do remember Scooby-Doo from that.
Yeah.
And then I did go to YouTube. I had to research a little bit and remind myself.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, we've got, has HBO Max come to England yet?
Means nothing to me.
Every season of, HBO Max has like every season of Scooby-Doo since 1968, which is a lot of Scooby-Doo. Yeah, that was, this was very, very cool and just loopy and strange. And
oh yes, it was fun to write. Yeah. I enjoyed doing it.
Oh, that's very cool. Thank you. John Pritchard, you're on, right? I thought I saw you on. If we don't have John, I apologize.
Tonight, I'll be playing the role of John.
Right. Okay, well, if John's not here to talk about, he has to take off on the 3 Days of the Jackal. And I mean, well, actually, Day of the Jackal / 3 Days of the Condor, which is a really wonderful pastiche of New York stories, and that's okay. I encourage you to check it out. And Rob, thank you so much, and for being up so late with us, by the way.
That's fine.
It is so it means a lot to me that you would stay up so late to talk about this.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, Heath, you're calling in from Arkansas, and I have known you for something going on 20 years, and I was very excited to talk to you. Tell me about your story. How do you pronounce it? Folk?
It's Falk.
Falk.
Falk, Arkansas. If anybody is a love of cryptozoology or a little movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek, you know the weight behind the word Falk, Arkansas. And I had this idea to write this story I saw on Facebook where you had a pitch for these thinly veiled stories, and I was actually reading the latest book by Lyle Blackburn, who's like the foremost authority of cryptozoology when it comes to Falk, Arkansas. And he had a case book of the Legend of Boggy Creek and all the sightings from the beginning to present day. And you pitched this story, and I just had this idea of tying the Legend of Boggy Creek into another franchise that when I watched as a kid, I never could understand why Bigfoot showed up there. It never made sense. So I thought there's a way to tie these two stories together. So this story kind of serves as a sequel to The Legend of Boggy Creek, and then kind of a prequel to a storyline to a beloved 1970s franchise. It follows the Wayne boys, the brothers. They take their family to Falk, Arkansas to start over. They don't realize that there's a cryptid or cryptids that roam the woods, the waterways of Falk. And over the course of a couple of days, they realize starting over in Falk's not a good idea. And I hope that the readers will get that atmospheric tension and the terror that they experienced a couple of days, because I grew up in the country. If you go out at night and you stand outside, I was always told it's not to be afraid of what's in the dark. Be afraid of the things you can't see in the dark. Dark's nothing to be afraid of, but you hear all these weird noises and crunching and popping around. And so this story kind of wrote itself for me. In fact, I wrote the last line of the story before I wrote the first line. And I had a lot of fun writing it. And I'm in the firm belief you can't have too many Bigfoot stories. So I'm glad it's out there. And I don't think there's a Bigfoot story like this one out there. I hope that folks enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed writing it.
You mentioned the Legend of Boggy Creek, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I was thinking about Bigfoot and we can say it, on the $6 Million Man. But man, Legend of Boggy Creek, I remember watching that and being terrified. By the way, do y'all remember the Legend of Boggy Creek? Does anybody else here, or is this okay? I see some of you nodding. Some of you are like, no, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. The Legend of Boggy Creek was, and there were two of them, right? There was Legend of Boggy Creek and the Barbaric Beast of Boggy Creek, and
there was actually another one too. That they awful sequels, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these were not expensive movies, but they did, the atmosphere, just the thick tension. You hear the bugs at night while you're outside, and there's something roaming around, outside your cabin. Like, oh my God, that freaked me out when I was a kid. So I do. I love how you hearken to that stuff, and also your tie-in to 70s science fiction television. So that was really cool. You have a radio background, right? I mean, I seem to remember you haven't really heavily been a writer. But you came from a radio background.
I've been writing my entire life, but to be honest, this is the first story I've ever submitted to anyone. And so you're the first one. I'm a writing virgin, I guess. The first time I've done this. I have done radio. I started radio when I was 15 years old, and 51 now, so I've done it for a long time. I still work in radio now. I'm a program director, music director for a country music station. That's just all I've done my entire life. But I write in my free time, but I've never had that courage to say, hey, here's a story I want to submit until now.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, you were a very good reviewer. I know I've read a lot of your stuff, and man, we got to talk sometime about programming country music, because I would love to hear your thoughts about that. That is awesome. Well, thank you so much. Mr. Rutledge,
yes, sir.
Nearby in Georgia, your story actually, I mean, you used both a property that you already had, as well as another well-known 70s property from TV. And I don't want to say what it is. I'll let you do it. So All My Sins, what's going on?
Well, basically, it's based on Dark Shadows, and I was one of the kids who, watched Dark Shadows, got off the school bus, went in and watched it. And it started in 66, but it ran until 71. So it fit the profile. And I have recently been rewatching it. And the one thing I noticed was that, Barnabas Collins kills a lot of people. And most of them, you never find out what happened to them. Some of them are part of the plot, but I mean, he's going down to the Blue Whale every night and killing some, lady of the evening, and they just wander off apparently.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, well, that's sort of interesting. And then on the show, he gets cured of his vampirism. He becomes a human. And I thought, okay, so now you're human. What if all the vampires you made come back while you're human? And that was the approach. So that's what I did. And since I knew there were going to be a lot of vampires and it was going to turn ugly, I needed somebody to kill a lot of vampires. And one of my continuing characters is a 12,000-year-old barbarian named Karn. And he's been alive for all of recorded history and into prehistory. So I can put him pretty much anywhere because he was there. So it's the 1970s. I'll put Karn in there. It'll be a good time. There'll be a lot of killing and, head chopping and such. So that's what I did.
That's beautiful. This is, I think, one of the few where you're doing it's almost like a fanfic team up.
Oh, yeah.
Where you use one of your own characters and
Yep.
manage to put it into the world of a story.
I am a sucker for a crossover.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, a lot of these could be, called straight up fanfic.
Sure.
And it just so happens that but in fanfic, what you do is you keep the character name, and yeah, I love that. And if people haven't had a chance, where can they find the character of Karn in your other stories?
Karn so far has not appeared in any novels, but he's appeared in 11 short stories. So, if you go to the Amazon page and look at I'm in a lot of anthologies, and Karn's in 2 of the Snafu anthologies from Cohesion Press. There's a couple of other. He's in one of the stories that got me a mention in the year's best horror, which was pretty funny because it was a country English country house ghost story with a barbarian in it. Because everything's more fun with barbarians. But yeah, if you just go to Amazon, you can see where he is. But he was in the Christmas anthology, the Yuletide anthology that I did last year.
Yes,
Winter's Tale. So he gets around in 12,000 years.
That is wonderful. Okay, well, thank you very much. When we create this to share it out, when you share it out, please figure out a way to include references to where they can find the Karn stories. Thank you very much. Bryan Young, I know that you're on. I think I saw you there. Okay, so funny thing happened on the way to the war. This is your takeoff on MASH, and it's actually really, no pun intended, it's actually really cold-blooded. And talk to me about it.
So when I saw the call for this anthology, I was already in the middle of rewatching MASH for the first time since I was a kid, for some elements I wanted to take for a novel that I was doing. So I was really interested in the world. But as an adult, going back and watching MASH through the lens of today, seeing MASH from the 70s, commenting on Vietnam through the lens of Korea, was really interesting to me. And when I saw the horror element, I thought that I could try to use that to comment on something. And the best way to do that was try to build a Twilight Zone episode almost, which is a little earlier, but MASH was the 70s footnote. But I think the other really interesting thing about MASH is that it starts funny and gets more grim as the series goes on. And that's really how I tried to structure the story. But it was me really commenting on a character like Frank Burns, right? Yeah. Through the lens of today and what we know about that sort of hyper partisan conservative thought that I think Frank Burns really exemplified in the 70s, that MASH felt very ahead of its time in a lot of ways. And now it still feels oddly relevant. And so I was trying to put that modern lens on it. And so, but MASH also had so much anachronistic stuff in there. So I tried to work into my story a couple of anachronistic references that maybe hopefully people will pick out.
Can you give us an example of an anachronistic reference?
Well, so the main character is essentially sort of Frank Burns in disguise, but his name is actually Francis Smithers. And on The Simpsons, Mr. Burns's assistant is Waylon Smithers. So it was just
of course, yeah.
It was sort of one degree of separation there because, you know, there was all kinds of anachronistic comic books and things like that. You know, Radar is reading, you know, Silver Age Marvel comic books.
Yeah.
You know, during the Korean War, and they wouldn't be made for another decade, you know, so things like that. Just trying to play with that sort of thing.
That's really interesting. I really loved it, and it was one of those stories that you could tell that you had just been watching MASH. You'd just been sort of like pounding MASH episodes.
Yeah.
And it was just there. Yeah, that's really cool. Somebody was just posting today about this amazing episode where MASH had a timer in the bottom. Have you seen this one? I haven't even seen it.
There was an episode where they did do it. It was all in sort of real time, and it was Hawkeye was trying to save somebody's life, and I think he had his hand in the guy's heart, trying to like hand massage it while everybody else put everything together. I think Alan Alda even directed that episode, and it was just really terrific. And it was amazing to see, going back and revisiting MASH, how many television tropes they really invented there, you know, where they had the episode where they ran everything in real time, or they had the episode where, you know, they did it all from one character's POV, you know, first person or things like that.
We had a documentary episode where everybody's talking to the camera. Yeah.
They did a lot of stuff like that. It's actually, it felt really rewarding. You know, watching MASH as a kid, it kind of, most of it just goes over your head, but coming back as an adult, especially as an adult trained, you know, in the craft of writing, how sharp those scripts were. So if anybody actually looks at my story and says it's even close to an actual MASH episode, I'll be really pleased with that, because those writers are just, they were, you know, they were hitting home runs most of the time.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. I mean, that's really, really great. And I loved reminiscing about this stuff. It's just like looking through it's like going down a slide into the MASH universe. I don't think that we've got Mr. Jones, because I believe it's the other side of the earth for him. Scott Pearson, I know that you're on, I believe. Yep. Can you tell us about the murder couple? I want to say about this, in the same way that a lot of these, like James Moore's and Bryan Young's, they just felt like perfect, you know, facsimiles. Murder Couple feels like an actual sitcom episode. I mean, down to the beats and everything. So talk to me about it.
Well, when you sent out the invite on the email, and you were giving ideas for what you were looking for, you mentioned something about someone being a serial killer. And as soon as I read that, it just immediately popped into my head that if Oscar Madison was a serial killer, Felix Unger would have to be cleaning up after him.
Yeah.
And so that idea popped into my head immediately. But the funny thing is that when I pitched it to you, I was imagining that it would be a very dark, melodramatic story, a sort of, you know, a Riverdale take on The Odd Couple. And I was watching a couple episodes of the classic sitcom just to, because I hadn't seen it in years. And so I watched a couple episodes, and then I started writing it. And when I started writing it, it just came out as the sitcom.
Yeah.
Despite what my original intention had been. And it just, the iconic performances of Tony Randall and Jack Klugman just took over. And those characters are so, so well written and so well performed by those actors that, you know, sometimes I didn't really feel like I was writing it. It's like once I came up with the concept and you drop those characters in there, they just start saying their lines.
Yeah.
And so I did find myself really writing to the beats of a sitcom, writing, you know, the one-liners, writing. One of the things I had fun doing was when I work on my other stories, one of my pet peeves as a writer and a reader is when characters call other characters by their name lots in dialogue, because that's not how real life is. But that's definitely how sitcoms are.
Yeah.
And so I was always having them call each other by name. And the other challenge for me was that I wanted the characters to be likable. So even though bodies were starting to pile up, I wanted to come up with a backstory for them and a plot for them where you didn't start hating them because they were horrible killers. And so I came up with ways to keep them sympathetic even as the bodies pile up.
It's such a farce. It reminds me a lot of like arson. This is going to age me, but like Arsenic and Old Lace and stuff like that, where bodies just tend to just, you know, murder is just something that happens in drawing rooms, and you know, it was really fun. I love the name checking of you know, like Mel Torme and stuff like that, and it's neat. It's another one just like the one about Sanford and Son, where it makes you just want to go back and watch one of the episodes.
I couldn't believe that I wrote a bunch of Mel Torme jokes. I was just writing this stuff and I was thinking, what am I doing? This is crazy, but it, you know, it was just a perfect 70s reference.
Well, the cool thing is, you know, if we end up doing like thinly veiled 80s or thinly veiled 90s, you can just imagine the references will be totally different references. I mean, actually, Mel Torme might still make it in because of Night Court, but other than that, you know, you'll start to hear totally different stuff. Well, that's really cool. I mean, thank you very much, and that was a lot of fun. I think James Moore's not with us, and I cannot remember. But anyway, you should check out the Shreveport Slasher. It really does read like an episode of The Night Stalker. In fact, Charles, I know that you dig The Night Stalker, so you would probably get a kick out of that if you haven't.
Well, it's actually kind of funny because my original idea was The Night Stalker goes to Collinsport.
Oh, yeah.
And I told Jim, hey, I'm going to be in this thing. You ought to do something. He goes, great, I'll do The Night Stalker. And I went, okay.
And you're like, confound it. Yeah.
Yep. So
sure.
I let him take it. But he did a really good job.
It is a lovely job. It really sounds like the way that Kolchak would read into.
I can hear Darren McGavin saying that. Yeah, just
yes.
like, yeah.
Yeah. It's another one. You can tell that everybody in this collection like really went deep into, or at least gave us the illusion that they spent a lot of time just listening to, you know, to Fred Sanford or Daryl Kolchak or what have you, Carl Kolchak. We do not have Alethea Kontis. I have to say, her story, The Confessions of the Ex-Future Mrs. X, is the story of the ex-wife of Willy Wonka, and it's mind-blowing. It's a wonderful voice, and it's a really beautiful piece. So if you get a chance to look at that, my story, I do have a story, and it is These Days Are Ours, and I won't go too long into it. But it is something that I always wanted to tell. I had two choices. I was either going to tell a backstage story of a wild night during the filming of the Paul Lynde Halloween special, where Paul Lynde and Margaret Hamilton and Paul Stanley go on a wild ride together for reasons that and the fact that I didn't write the story is because I couldn't figure out the reasons. So that story still remains to be told. But the other one is I wanted to talk about the disappearance of Chuck from Happy Days. And if you ever watched Happy Days, there was an older brother. He went to college. He was, you know, he gave Richie advice. And then one day, Richie and the dining room disappeared. And I thought, well, what would happen on the morning that Howard Cunningham woke up and his dining room and his oldest son were missing? And so that was what it is. But I have to say that idea was very similar to an idea that I can't remember from the Twilight Zone magazine in the early 80s. They did a story about a detective, you know, like Mike Hammer, who walks into his kitchen and his family's all different because they've updated the show from the 50s to the 80s and they've switched things around because he's in a TV show and it's been updated. So I'm not the first person to use that idea. I've definitely got to, I've got to find that, man. I got to dig up some old Twilight Zone magazines and figure it out. I want to throw it open for questions if there are any questions, but I have a question first. I want to ask you guys as a group, if you could go to a place from 1970s stories, either from your own or from somebody else's or from whatever, from these pop culture sets, where would you go to? Like where, like if you could wake up in the morning and you were in the place of one of these shows, you know, where would that be? And anybody can answer. I'm just curious. And I have an answer if somebody else wants to take a moment to think.
I definitely would go to Collinwood.
I was going to say the Blue Whale. I would want to go. If you don't know, the Blue Whale is the place where everybody gathers for their mugs of beer and
they have 2 songs on the jukebox.
Oh my God! I just want to go to there. I want to be there and look out those windows and see those curtains blowing, and I want to wake up at the Blue Whale.
I'd like to go into the foyer at Collinwood because as a kid, that was like where everything happened. You know, everybody came through the door. They'd always knock 3 times.
Yes.
You know, like Tony Orlando. I would go there.
Yeah. Does anybody else have an answer for that? If not, we will move on to questions Julia has been.
Well, if I could be in New York in the 1970s, there would be a lot of rock concerts that would be available to be seen at reasonable prices.
Oh yeah. Do you know?
I totally hang out with 70s Stan Lee and 70s Marvel. That'd be fun.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I've been wanting to see, I hope someday somebody makes a movie of this in the 70s, is Bette Midler and Barry Manilow spent a couple of years playing at the Continental, I think it's the Continental Bathhouse, and you have some recordings of her on YouTube. Very young Bette Midler doing Bob Dylan songs and stuff like that, and it's just so great it brings tears to your eyes. And I mean, if you think about a crystallized time, like Bette Midler and Barry Manilow playing in a bathhouse in the 70s, that's, God, first of all, what a great miniseries that would be. Like, you know, just covering just what a crazy place. Yeah. So that's 2 answers for me. All right, Julia, do you have any questions from the audience?
Well, I have a question from me, which is, so Charles already admitted to being a writing virgin. So I'm wondering if anybody else.
No, that was Heath.
Heath. Sorry, Heath. Yeah, I was wondering if anybody else has stepped out of their comfort zone in writing. Either they've not written a short story, or this is just completely different from anything else they've ever done.
This is my second publication. So my debut novel came out last November. Self-published. Actually, I work with a hybrid publisher, but this is my first published short story. So excited about that prospect. I've been able to check that off of my bucket list.
That's
very cool.
Thank you.
For me, it's probably my first real genre horror story. I've had multiple short stories published in a bunch of different places. I have 3 novels out, 4 novels out. I have 1 nonfiction book out. I'm usually published by Tor or Angry Robot Books. I read science fiction novels about robots who eat each other, so some people think that they're kind of horror novels. There's the opening of a trilogy that I wrote opens with like a little girl robot eating her grandmother alive by pre-digesting her. And they let me market that as science fiction, so they'll let you do anything these days. But this is probably, aside from, I wrote a short story for Postscripts to Darkness called Dreams in the Ditch House, which was about like a female, like a women in tech fraternity. That was about like smart smart materials that, change rooms around you. But it still had like kind of a near future technology bent to it, and it was definitely set in sort of a present day or near future context, not not historical, not a period of time that had already passed, and certainly not rooted in the concerns of that time period, and definitely not like in dialogue with certain horror themes, but not like a horror. I'm not sure if it rode the line, like it really, really rode the line. And my friend Gemma Files said, like, I don't know how you got away with this, but you did. And everybody should read Gemma's books if you can lay hold of them. And this one, but I thought of this one as like the first kind of like dedicated, like really, biting in, with all your teeth, kind of horror story.
Getting into the stuff that your husband does, right?
Well, yeah. Well, he does very I think I would say so. Like I think we're getting into the material that we're both familiar with. Like it's funny because like I'm more of a consumer of stuff like Halloween than he is. Like he will be like, oh, are you like he will come home or walk into the room and I'm watching Halloween. And he's like, oh, are you having a bad day? and stuff. And that's quite the opposite to him. We're huge. What did we watch? That we were really impressed with recently, David. I'm blanking. But like we are consumers of a lot of horror fiction and horror media. But I will totally get into a formulaic slasher because it's formulaic in the same way that my mom would watch Anne of Green Gables a million times.
Yeah.
Because it has certain beats and it repeats. And that was, I think, like what I wanted to do with the story. It was sort of talk about like, well, what is happening like outside the frame of this?
Yeah. That's a big way that, there's several ways that you could take any fanfic really. And what we're doing is fanfic, right? So you can either, there's so many different variants of fanfic, but one is what's happening outside the frame.
What are you not seeing? And I had done a lot of work both as a fanfic writer and then like as a scholar of it. Like I had done a master's degree that specialized in sort of fan studies and fan culture, and I'd read there's outside of this frame, there's a whole bunch of books about fan fiction and fan culture and stuff. So, and David and I had edited together a Canadian anthology of James Bond stories.
Oh, really?
Because James Bond here is in the public domain.
Really?
Yes. And so when that happened, we did a James Bond anthology.
How the hell did that happen? That's amazing.
Canada has better longer laws. Has better laws.
Looks like I'm moving.
Yeah. Come on up. Come and play in our Vesper water.
And just for the rest of us, where are you located?
We live in Toronto. Okay. And so we had done a story called or we'd done an anthology called License Expired.
Nice.
The unauthorized
Very
James
good.
Bond.
Fantastic.
And it's fantastic. You cannot buy it hardly anywhere. You're gonna have to, when the border is open again, you're all gonna have to come up here and lay hold of a copy somehow. Because it's very illegal for us to sell it.
That's amazing.
Almost anywhere else. So it's like we made like it's like almost having made, like a bootleg record from another country.
Sure.
It's literary moonshine.
It really is. It really is.
So what is one thing, like maybe do a lightning round, like a sentence. What is one thing that you each need to be able to write? Like you just feel like, if I don't have this, I can't really get in the zone.
Give me an example of what you mean by that. Just so
I need a private space. I need a cup of coffee. I need a muse. I need to have just watched something inspirational, something like that.
I start every story with coffee and an apple fritter.
Nice.
Really?
It's become as much as drinking. I drink writer's tears whiskey when I celebrate a writing milestone. So at the end of finishing a manuscript or when something gets published or something like this, I'll pour a little glass, but yeah, when I start a story, I need an apple fritter and a cup of coffee.
For me, it's just having the inspiration. So when I found out, Jason put the call out, and I was in the middle of writing something else, and I was like, I did not have the time for this. But there's a Rick and Morty meme that has little Morty going, "I'm in, you son of a bitch," which is like, I'm gonna do it. I can't not write this because it was such a fun
Damn you.
theme. Yeah, exactly. Curse you.
I would say that having a deadline is a very important part of it.
That's a good one.
That's one of the reasons over the last year or so I've been in 4 anthologies, 2 of them being Castle of Horror. Yeah. And I had just decided that I needed to get back to more writing. My writing had languished a bit, and so the fun has been. Part of the fun of Castle of Horror was that most of my published writing falls broadly into science fiction. And so the inspiration to try to write something more in the horror field was a nice challenge. And then just getting that external deadline to make sure that you get the words on the page has helped a lot. And although this, the new one, The Murder Couple, turned out to be nowhere near as horrific as I had intended, since it turns into a straight comedy. But writing outside your comfort zone can be very inspiring as well.
That's wonderful.
For me, I always need to know the ending of a story. I can't write anything until I've got it all planned in my head, and I know what the last line is almost in everything I do before I start it. So that's what I need to do. I sort of an agony of working out the whole story without writing anything until I know what the ending is going to be, and then I can start it.
Wow.
I bet that Weeping Angel probably helps you, inspire you with the horror.
I knew the ending of The Murder Couple before I knew how much of the middle of the story was going to go.
Yeah.
I don't want to know anything. I just start.
You don't need anything?
No.
Charles?
I just sit down and start writing. I don't want to know where it's going. I don't want to know what's going to happen. I won't write it if I do.
Is there like a specific time or place that you have to write, or do you just, wherever you are, you just write?
Wherever I am.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
You find when you do that, it's like you surprise yourself when the story goes in.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, how did that happen? Right?
It's funny. Joe Lansdale does this because I've taught him about that. But if I even tell you much of the plot, I'll never write it. I can tell the story one time.
I've heard this before. You're not alone. A lot of people say that, and I've found it to be true. There's something. Now, I remember talking to Ernie Klein, and he said, "No, that's bullshit. I told the story of Ready Player One to like 9 million different people while I was writing it."
Yeah, but that's him.
Yeah, but me personally, I also have the thing that Charles is talking about, where if I talk about the story too much, I kind of feel like I've already done it.
I'm done.
And then you don't need, and then it gets really tiresome and hard.
But how do you differentiate that from your outlining? Because I know you outline.
Yeah, I don't know, man.
Is that different? It's different because you're keeping it to yourself.
You're keeping it to yourself.
Yeah.
That's right. But I will say that I agree with Scott that when you give me a deadline, that really helps. When I say, okay, Ensure, you're my accountability buddy, and I need to give you this book by whatever it is. Like, what does it say? I apparently owe you a book on the 3rd of August. So so that is very helpful to me. It makes me wonder what I'm doing with my life right this instant, because apparently I owe you a book on the 3rd of August, which is like 6 weeks from now. So
what do you need, Ensure?
I guess it's kind of plot and inspiration as well. I in order for me to write, I have to, I'm in a scene, I want to know where that scene is going. There has to be something significant. There has to have some meaning to it. Otherwise, why is it in the book, right? Otherwise, you're just writing. So even if it's not the main plot point, there has to be somewhere it's going to, right? whether it's just a character development or a beat or whatever, I have to know what that is when I'm writing that scene. And so I dive into the scene, and then I dive into the next one, and eventually, you know, we get somewhere. But I do it in little chunks, which is probably why I'm such a slow writer too.
For me, it depends on what I'm writing, right? So if I'm writing a novel, then I'm with you all. I want to know how it ends and how I get there, and sort of a much more detailed outline. For a short story, sometimes I'll know that. Sometimes I'll just start out and just start writing. But you know, short stories are a lot shorter to take those detours on, and you don't want to. I don't want to do that on a novel, because I'll end up, you know, 40,000 words down the wrong path.
Yeah.
It's harder to backtrack that far.
Yeah.
Excellent.
When you're doing 5,000 words on a short, you know, tops, you know, that 5,000 words, you could do that in a couple of days, and redoing that or backtracking, it's not as big of an investment.
Right. Right.
Well,
Yeah,
I
have a couple. I'm sorry, Andrew.
That's okay. Well, I had a question, because something you brought up and Charles brought up. I'm curious, anybody else had a B story that they were intentionally going to write, you were going to write first, and then they decided to write this one instead? So like for Jason, it was that Pauline special.
Right.
Charles, it's something else. So I'm curious if there was like an alternate reality version of this anthology. What was the other story idea that you were kicking around before you wrote the one that you had? For me, I was thinking about doing a play on Greece and doing kind of like a high school slasher kind of thing, and have Frenchie be the one who kills everyone, right? So I'm curious if anybody else had an alternate story, and if there was this alternate anthology that we could have put out.
I was thinking, before I hit on MASH, which felt like it was right in front of me, I was really thinking in All the President's Men, where Woodward and Bernstein are getting into some Lovecraft kind of stuff.
Oh,
right.
Yeah,
I would have loved to have read.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll still write it.
We would like you to write that immediately.
Now I've got a deadline.
I
There's so
briefly
many-
gave thought
Sorry.
to writing a take on Taxi. Taxi was another one of my favorite
Oh,
shows.
good.
Taxi, MASH, you know, Star Trek. Those are those were the shows that I watched like after school, religiously. And I thought about doing Taxi for a minute. And couldn't kind of figure out. There were so many people there that I couldn't really figure out how to hone it and get it so that it made sense without, you know, jumping off to all the different characters that were there, because there's so many rich characters on that show.
Yeah.
Sanford and Son was right there with it, and I think I felt more comfortable with it because one, you know, I could focus on the two characters, and two, you know, it's just so much a part of television history, I think, in the 70s, especially for Black television, you know, and having two prominent Black characters in the 70s and kind of carrying that even into the 80s. And it's a show that still holds up. Taxi still holds up too, obviously, but Sanford and Son really just kind of had that kick for me.
Thank you.
I kind of wish that I had done. Now you got me thinking. I kind of wish that I had done like a Rockford or a Columbo. Would have been fun, especially more Columbo actually, because like you see the end, or you see you see who did it, or what the game is, and then you watch this guy, you know, wander into, you know,
in a sense, Columbo's an anthology like show, right? You know the bad guy, and you're just watching him interact with people.
Yeah, the satisfaction is sort of watching him learn the thing that you always learn, the thing that you know. Like, how did he figure out the thing that you already know?
Yeah.
I kind of thought about doing a riff on Alien at one point, but I just assumed somebody would do that, and so I figured I'd go with something that is a little more out there, but it never happened. So I guess I should have done the Alien story.
You do it for the 80s, Aliens too.
Yeah, I know. That's what I was thinking. I was like, I got to dib that right now.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement about the 80s one already, so I think we should get on that. By we, I mean Jason and Incher.
Yes. I should mention my idea, I believe, was actually literally just stolen from Julia. The idea of doing the story about
Accurate.
the disappearance of Chuck probably came from Julia, and then I have over time come to believe that it was my idea.
No, I literally said, "Oh yeah, I'll totally do a story for the '70s one. I want to do something about how Chuck just disappeared after the first season."
Yeah, I have
And
no
then
memory of you
I
saying
never got around
but
to writing it. And then after he dismissed the Paul Lynde thing, he goes, "I think I'm going to do a story about how Chuck disappeared." And I was like, "Well, I was going to do that story, but since I never actually did it and I have no intention of actually doing it, you can have it."
Yeah, and that's our marriage in a
Yeah.
nutshell. I mean, that's actually
Everything. One of Jason's things that he likes to say is that ideas came from the room, which means me.
Yes, Jeremiah says that was an inception. She was like, "Oh, do the disappearance of Chuck." Yeah, very cool. Yeah, for me, the meta stuff is something I really want to do. Like I love the idea. I don't know why Paul Lynde has been in my head so much, but I was watching a lot of '60s stuff, and he was like in everything. But there was a weird thing where he had a show, and the show wasn't popular. It got canceled, and he was made the lead of another show, and so they remade that whole show, and suddenly Paul Lynde was in it. And I thought, there's more meta stuff you could do where people's worlds are just being turned upside down. The Doris Day program went through 3 seasons with 3 different concepts for her character, where suddenly she's a journalist and now she's running a farm. And I'm like, how did people keep tuning in to a show where literally they just changed the story, you know? And
They were there for Doris Day. They didn't care what she was doing.
apparently that's the answer. It's just whatever. This is what's on tonight. There's three channels, and so Doris Day is what we're watching. Yeah, my goodness. Wow. Well, I know that we're way over time. I want to throw it open to you guys, because I know that I, as hosting as I have been, I've dominated the conversation. So if there's anything else that you'd like to observe or think about or throw out, feel free. You've all been really good on not stepping on one another, so I trust you'll figure this out as well. So, you know, if you have any other comments, you know, now's a chance, and I do encourage people to pick up a copy of Thinly Veiled, which just came out today in ebook. So.
I just want to say thanks for putting the collection together. It was a lot of fun to put my story together, and you know, I got my copy of the book yesterday, and it looks great, and I can't wait to dive into everybody else's stories.
Yeah, I got a shout out to Insure just for being an amazing, you know, everything that he does to lay out and edit. I want to say graphic designer, but it's so much more than that. It's like whatever you are. Just brilliant, all around brilliant person.
Thank you. That's so sweet. Thank you. You know, I enjoy doing it. It's a lot of fun for me to be able to do those layouts. So, yeah.
I was going to ask Jeremiah.
Yeah.
Because we're both comic book guys. The Darkhold, didn't that start in Werewolf by Night?
I think it did. You know, I just read about it a little more today because I was doing a little extra research to touch up for my discussion on my own story. And I read where it was from. I can't remember off the top of my head now. But it's one of those things, like, I would love to get to write a Marvel story about Doctor Strange with the Darkhold. I have this whole thing. I have a whole like pitch laid out just in case Marvel ever calls me one day.
That's cool.
Well, you know, they had the Darkhold on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Yeah, yeah.
No longer canon, apparently, before it appeared in the MCU.
Well,
yeah.
It's weird because they've got their sort of pseudo Lovecraftian, you know, there's Chthon.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I wonder where they got that idea. And Doctor Strange fought a bunch of, you know, other creatures because at that time they couldn't use the Lovecraftian stuff. Now they could. And it's just really funny how all that goes.
Shumagorath, he's the best. Big eyeball tentacle. He looks awesome.
Yep, and that's actually Robert E. Howard.
Yeah.
Yeah. They could use that because they had the Conan license at the time. And do again.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I actually read that Conan comic. So.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Yeah. Jim Zub.
Well, I thank you all for all of your patience and for being on. I'm really honored to have had a chance to edit with you and work with you and listen to you. and it's humbling. And for those of you who dialed in, thank you so much for joining us. It means a lot to me, and I hope to see you guys again probably in another half year. So have a fantastic evening, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Nice to see
Appreciate it.
everyone. Good night,
Thank-
everybody.
Everybody.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Ciao.